Fantasy football draft season officially in full swing. We're going to take a look at the wide receiver position today, look at some players with comparable ADPs, and tell you which of those two players you should be taking in your fantasy drafts this season. So let's start out near the top of the board. We're talking guys who tend to go early round 2, sometimes even late first round. Puka Nacua versus Drake London. So a really difficult one right off the bat. Both of these guys are a part of that kind of second tier, almost a 1B of wide receivers. You see Jamar Chase usually go somewhere in the top 1, 2, 3 picks. CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson shortly after. But then you got Malik Neighbors, you got Amon-Ra St. Brown, Brian Thomas Jr., Nico Collins, Puka Nacua, and Drake London has officially asserted himself as part of that tier. Then you get a slight drop down to your A.J. Browns, Ladd McConkey's, Garrett Wilsons, etc. I'll tell you right off the bat, I've been drafting a lot more Drake London than I have Puka Nacua. And look, it's tough to deny the upside with Nacua. He commands a ton of targets for the Rams, great hands, diverse route runner, had a huge second half after coming back from an early season injury, put up 96 yards per game on over 10 targets per game over the Rams' final 10 contests. On a per-game basis, he was the wide receiver 3 last season, behind only Jamar Chase and Chris Godwin. And, of course, Chris Godwin only played 7 games. But when it comes to Nacua, I really do worry about the injuries. Nacua plays such a physical style. He did stay healthy as a rookie and had a monster year, but he missed 8 games a year ago. It's a guy who had injury issues in college. And on top of that, now his quarterback, Matthew Stafford, is also injured. He's hanging out in some sort of futuristic camper type of device at Rams camp right now, dealing with a back injury. There's just a little too much going on the injury front right now with the Rams. There's also the addition of Davante Adams. And yes, like Cooper Kupp, he's an older receiver. He's maybe not the guy that he was 3 or 4 years ago. But to me, he's shown far fewer signs of decline than Cooper Kupp did last season. Adams really makes his bones in the red zone. He's done that his entire career. A huge percentage of his career touchdowns have come inside the 20-yard line, even inside the 10. You remember back to those peak Green Bay days, Aaron Rodgers, it's 1st and goal from the 2. He's finding Davante Adams. I don't know if we're going to see it to that extreme with Matthew Stafford in LA, but I do expect him to emerge as the primary red zone guy whenever the Rams are throwing it in that range. Meanwhile, you have Drake London, who was not as productive as Nacua on a per-game basis. He was about 2 fantasy points per game behind Nacua last season, but he's missed just 1 game in his first 3 years in the NFL. And London, I thought, was partially handicapped by Kirk Cousins for a good chunk of last season. London got off to a decent start, was able to keep his head above water through the middle of the year, but Cousins' inability to throw downfield, his inability to not throw crushing interceptions every single week really hampered the Falcons' offense. Now, I don't want to put too much stock into 3 Michael Penix starts at the end of last year, but in those 3 starts, Drake London racked up 39 targets, 31 of those, by the way, coming in the final 2 weeks of the season, 22 catches, 352 yards, 2 touchdowns in those final 3 games. To me, it was clear Michael Penix brought a completely different dimension to the Falcons' offense. Huge arm, not afraid to take chances down the field. He was the perfect quarterback for someone like Drake London, who was targeted a career-high 18 times in Week 18 against the Carolina Panthers. Again, I don't want to overload how much we put into that small sample, but you got to kind of believe one way or the other on Michael Penix, and I'm in, especially when it comes to boosting his number 1 target. And that's exactly what Drake London should be this season for the Falcons. I like Darnell Mooney. He's banged up right now. We have no idea if he's going to be available for the start of the season. Could very well miss a couple of games to begin the year. It's pretty thin in that Falcons receiver group after Mooney. We'll see on Kyle Pitts. He's apparently meshed well with Michael Penix at camp, but I think we all agree we need to see it before we officially buy in once again on Kyle Pitts. The bottom line is it's tough to differentiate this second tier of receivers. You can make a case for just about any of them, but if I have my choice between Puka Nacua and Drake London, I'm chasing the upside on London under the belief that he might have another level to go up that we haven't seen yet, and he hasn't yet had his best fantasy season. Just a reminder before we get to our next 2 receivers, put in that code. You see it right there on your screen, YouTube15. Use that at RotoWire.com. 15% off anything we offer over at RotoWire. You can check out our draft planner, the draft analyzer. We got a brand new mock draft tool. You get access to our app. Go check it out. Everything we have to offer at RotoWire, 15% off. Just put in that code YouTube15. As we move down the board a little bit, we got 2 more receivers to talk about. Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. We're going to put him up against Jaylen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. 2 guys going in the same range right now. Really interesting one, really tough one. You have a fairly high degree of safety in my mind with Zay Flowers, wide receiver 31 and 32 in per game production through his first 2 NFL seasons. He's going right in that same range again this season. Now, we did lead the Ravens in targets last year with 116. That was 44 more than Rashad Bateman, 47 more than Mark Andrews. So he is the number 1 target, but still felt like there should be more upside with Zay Flowers as the clear number 1 in a great offense that piles up a ton of points. But as we know, the Ravens are extremely run heavy. They have 2 tight ends they like in Andrews and Isaiah Likely. Bateman certainly emerged as more of a factor than we expected a year ago. They gave him a contract this summer. We'll see if that kind of production continues. Despite all these things, Flowers still remains relatively safe to me, but the week-to-week production does tend to vary. 5 games last season where he gave you basically a total dud, less than 6 PPR points. He's not heavily involved as a red zone target, only had 7 targets in the red zone last year. That was fewer than Rashad Bateman, obviously fewer than the 2 tight ends. And Lamar Jackson is coming off of the best passing season of his career. Would expect some regression from Lamar after he threw 41 touchdowns a year ago. On the other side of this one, Jaylen Waddle, a total wild card. Really, the entire Dolphins offense, to me, is a wild card. There's some degree of safety, I suppose, in Devon Achane if he stays healthy, but good luck figuring out the rest. Once again, Waddle missed some time last season, but he still played in 15 games, finished as the wide receiver 50 in per game value, less than ideal relative to expectations. Now, you could blame Tua's injury. It cratered the entire Dolphins offense for more than a month, but what really worries me is that even once Tua returned, neither Waddle nor Tyreek Hill really looked like themselves the rest of the way. 2 years ago, Jaylen Waddle was your wide receiver 21. He was wide receiver 12 and 15 in his first 2 years in the NFL. So we know what the potential is for Jaylen Waddle when this Dolphins offense is humming. The question is whether you believe in the Dolphins, whether you believe in Mike McDaniel to get this thing turned around. And frankly, I'm not sure I do. But taking a chance on Waddle as the wide receiver 31, it's still appealing. He was closer to the wide receiver 19, 20 this time last year. The big problem for me, though, is you have dual injuries to worry about, compounding injuries in this Dolphins offense. Waddle himself, of course, needs to stay healthy, but so does Tua, who is maybe the most injury-prone quarterback in the NFL. There is a world, of course, in which Tyreek Hill and that whole situation just completely blows up, whether it's an injury, off-field issues, who knows, maybe he demands a trade out of Miami. Anything is on the table with Tyreek Hill. So as you can see, there are plenty of variables when it comes to Waddle, when it comes to this Dolphins offense as a whole. Again, Flowers, we can quibble about the week-to-week production, but I think you know what to expect in that Ravens offense. To me, this one comes down to what does your roster look like? What is your tolerance for risk as you go through your draft? If you already have a couple of receivers on your roster, then maybe take a shot on Jaylen Waddle. Take a shot on that upside. But if you're going running back heavy, maybe you take an early tight end or an early quarterback, you're drafting at this spot to be your wide receiver 2. In that situation, I would maybe lean on the safety of Zay Flowers. We'll finish out with one more wide receiver comparison, and we're going all the way down now close to pick 100 at the NFFC. Cooper Kupp versus Chris Godwin. So I've had to eat crow on Chris Godwin in recent weeks. It's sounding more and more likely that he could miss time to begin the year. I had taken more of an optimistic view on what the Buccaneers had told us about Chris Godwin, but I now expect him to miss at least week 1. And on top of that, Puka has been maybe the single buzziest rookie in all of fantasy football. Now, make no mistake, I'm still in on Chris Godwin, especially when you look at the new price, pick 95 to maybe 105 in the NFFC. I totally get the concerns about the injury. I get the concerns about Puka eating into his workload, but we got to keep in mind the Bucs did just pay Chris Godwin this offseason. Puka isn't just going to step in and take his spot in that wide receiver group. There could be a ramp-up period once Chris Godwin is back. Puka is another mouth to feed. I totally get those concerns. But once Godwin is fully up to speed, I expect him to reassert himself as one of the top 2 targets for Baker Mayfield, much like he was last season. He was Baker Mayfield's go-to guy until that injury in week 7, vastly outproducing Mike Evans. And speaking of Mike Evans, love the guy. Nobody's been more consistent over the last decade. Starting to get into his mid-30s. You do wonder if maybe this is the year that the injuries really catch up to him. Does he take a step back physically? I think if we worry about Puka encroaching on these receivers in Tampa Bay, some of that has to trickle down to Mike Evans as well. He's not just going to take away from Chris Godwin. So overall, I've had to cool off on Chris Godwin compared to where I was a couple months ago. But again, the discount is now baked in. I think it's appropriate. I'm okay with him at this cost. With Cooper Kupp, to me, there's just not a ton of upside this season. Amazing player at his peak, no question about it, but very quickly fell off last season, fell out of favor for the LA Rams, and really looked like he lost a step over the second half of the season. You watch those Rams games, and it almost felt like Sean McVay, Matthew Stafford were going out of their way to not involve Cooper Kupp down the stretch. Sam Darnold, to me, a major question mark in Seattle. They have another new offensive coordinator, third in 3 years for the Seahawks. To me, it's fairly likely that Sam Darnold doesn't play at close to the same level that we saw through the entire fantasy season last year in Minnesota. They also have a target hog wide receiver already in Jackson Smith and Jigba. Kupp is the number 2, but do we fully trust him to stay healthy at this point? I could see a few splash weeks for Cooper Kupp, assuming he does stay healthy. Certainly if JSN were to go down at any point, then yeah, Cooper Kupp becomes very interesting. But there's just a lot of wish casting for me when it comes to Cooper Kupp. I think the name value exceeds the production at this point in his career. Again, Chris Godwin, the injury is a question mark. The surrounding talent in Tampa Bay could limit his upside, but I'm still willing to roll the dice on Chris Godwin under the belief that he'll be back early enough in the season to reassert himself as one of the most underrated wide receivers in the NFL, and what should again be a high volume, high scoring passing offense. The Bucs, yeah, they have to replace Liam Cohen. They hired internally. I don't think we see sweeping changes within that offense, and I certainly trust Baker Mayfield more than I do Sam Darnold playing for his third team in 3 years.